The outlines of the coast were dim. They waded through white water and white mist, their swords held above their heads. Swords were their only weapons. Each of the four possessed a blade of unusual size and design, but none bore a sword which occasionally murmured to itself, as did Elric's Stormbringer. Glancing back, Elric saw the captain standing at the rail, his blind face turned towards the island, his pale lips moving as if he spoke to himself. Now the water was waist deep and the sand beneath Eric's feet hardened and became smooth rock. He waded on, wary and ready to carry any attack to those who might be defending the island. Now the mist grew thinner, as if it could gain no hold on the land, and there were no obvious signs of defenders. Tucked into his belt, each man had a brand, its end wrapped in oiled cloth so that it should not be wet when the time came to light it. Similarly, each was equipped with a handful of smouldering tinder and a little firebox in a pouch attached to his belt, so that the brands could be instantly ignited. "Only fire will destroy this enemy forever," the captain had said again as he handed them their brands and their tinder boxes. As the mist cleared, it revealed a landscape of dense shadows. Shadows spread over red rock and yellow vegetation, and they were shadows of all shapes and dimensions, resembling all manner of things. They seemed to be cast by the huge, blood-coloured sun which stood at perpetual noon above the island. But what was disturbing about them was that the shadows themselves seemed without a source, as if the objects they represented were invisible or existed elsewhere than on the island itself. The sky, too, seemed full of these shadows. But whereas those on the island were still, those in the sky sometimes moved, perhaps when the clouds moved. And all the while the red sun poured down its bloody light and touched the 20 men with its unwelcome radiance, just as it touched the land. And at times as they advanced cautiously inland, a peculiar flickering light sometimes crossed the island, so that the outlines of the place became unsteady for a few seconds before returning to focus. Elric suspected his eyes and said nothing until Hound Serpent Tamer, who was having difficulty finding his land legs, remarked, "I've rarely been ashore, it's true, but I think the quality of this land is stranger than any other I've known. It shimmers. It distorts." Several voices agreed with him. "And from whence comes all these shadows?" Ashnar the Lynx stared about him in unashamed superstitious awe. "Why cannot we see that which casts them?" "It could be," Coram said, "that these shadows are cast by objects existing in other dimensions of the earth. If all dimensions meet here, as has been suggested, that could be a likely explanation." He put his silver hand to his embroidered eye patch. "This is not the strangest example I have witnessed of such a conjunction." "Likely," Otto Blenker snorted. "Pray let none give me an unlikely explanation, if you please." They pressed on through the shadows and the lurid light until they arrived at the outskirts of the ruins. These ruins, thought Elric, had something in common with the ramshackle city of Emiron, which he had visited on his quest for the Black Sword. But they were altogether more vast, more a collection of smaller cities, each one in a radically different architectural style. "Perhaps this is Tanalorn," said Coram, who had visited the place. "Or rather, all the versions of Tanalorn where have ever been. For Tanalorn exists in many forms, each depending upon the wishes of those who most desire to find her." "This is not the Tanalorn I expected to find," said Hawkmoon bitterly. "Nor I," added Ericose bleakly. "Perhaps it is not Tanalorn," said Elric. "Perhaps it is not." "Or perhaps this is a graveyard," said Coram distantly, frowning with his single eye. "A graveyard containing all the forgotten versions of that strange city." They began to clamber over the ruins, their arms clattering as they moved, heading for the centre of the place. Elric could tell by the introspective expressions in the faces of many of his companions that they, like him, were wondering if this were not a dream. Why else should they find themselves in this peculiar situation, unquestionably risking their lives, perhaps their souls, in a fight with which none of them was identified? Eric moved closer to Elric as they marched. "Have you noticed," said he, "the shadows now represent something?" Elric nodded. "You can tell from the ruins what some of the buildings looked like when they were whole. The shadows are the shadows of those buildings, the original buildings, before they became ruined." "Just so," said Eric. Together they shuddered. At last they approached the likely centre of the place, and there was a building which was not ruined. It stood in a cleared space, all curves and ribbons of metal and glowing tubes. "It resembles a machine more than a building," said Hawkmoon. "And a musical instrument more than a machine," Quorum mused. The party came to a halt, each group of 4 gathering about its leader. There was no question but that they had arrived at their goal. Now that Elric looked carefully at the building, he could see that it was in fact 2 buildings, both absolutely identical and joined at various points by curling systems of pipes which might be connecting corridors, though it was difficult to imagine what manner of being could utilize them. "2 buildings," said Eric. "We were not prepared for this. Shall we split up and attack both?" Instinctively, Elric felt that this action would be unwise. He shook his head. "I think we should go together into one, else our strength will be weakened." "I agree," said Hawkmoon, and the rest nodded. Thus, there being no cover to speak of, they marched boldly toward the nearest building to a point near the ground where a black opening of irregular proportions could be discerned. Ominously, there was still no sign of defenders. The buildings pulsed and glowed and occasionally whispered, and that was all. Elric and his party were the first to enter, finding themselves in a damp, warm passage, which curved almost immediately to the right. They were followed by the others until all stood in this passage, warily glaring ahead, expecting to be attacked. But no attack came. With Elric at their head, they moved on for some moments before the passage began to tremble violently and sent Hound Serpent-Tamer crashing to the floor, cursing. As the man in the sea-green armour scrambled up, a voice began to echo along the passage, seemingly coming from a great distance, yet nonetheless loud and irritable. "Ho, ho, ho," shrieked the voice. "Who invades me?" The passage's tremble subsided a little into a constant quivering motion. The voice became a muttering, detached and uncertain. "What attacks?" The 20 men glanced at one another in puzzlement. At length Elric shrugged and led the party on, and soon the passage had widened out into a hall whose walls, roof and floor were damp with sticky fluid, and whose air was hard to breathe. And now, somehow passing themselves through the walls of this hall, came the first of the defenders, ugly beasts who must be the servants of that mysterious brother and sister, Agak and Gagak. "Attack!" cried the distant voice. "Destroy this!" The beasts were a primitive sort, mostly gaping mouth and slithering body, but there were many of them oozing towards the 20 men, who quickly formed themselves into the 4 fighting units and prepared to defend themselves. The creatures made a dreadful slushing sound as they approached, and the ridges of bone which served them as teeth clashed as they reared up to snap at Elric and his companions. Elric whirled his sword, and it met hardly any resistance as it sliced through several of the things at once. But now the air was thicker than ever, and a stench threatened to overwhelm them as fluid drenched the floor. "Move on through them," Elric instructed, "hacking a path through as you go. Head for yonder opening," he pointed with his left hand. And so they advanced, cutting back hundreds of the primitive beasts and thus decreasing the breathability of the air. "Creatures are not hard to fight," gasped Hound Serpent Tamer, "but each one we kill robs us a little of our own chance of life." Elric was aware of the irony. Cunningly planned by our enemies, no doubt. He coughed and slashed again at a dozen of the beasts slithering towards him. The things were fearless, but they were stupid too. They made no attempt at strategy. Finally Elric reached the next passage where the air was slightly purer. He sucked gratefully at the sweeter atmosphere and waved his companions on. Sword arms rising and falling, they gradually retreated back into the passage, followed by only a few of the beasts. The creatures seemed reluctant to enter the passage. Elric suspected that somewhere within it there must lie a danger which even they feared. Well, there was nothing for it but to press on, and he was only grateful that all 20 had survived the initial ordeal. Gasping, they rested for a moment, leaning against the trembling walls of the passage, listening to the tones of that distant voice, now muffled and indistinct. "I like not this castle at all," growled Brute of Lashmar, inspecting a rent in his cloak where a creature had seized it. "High sorcery commands it." "It is only what we knew," Ashnar the Lynx reminded him, and Ashnar was plainly hard put to control his terror. The finger bones in his braids kept time with the trembling of the walls, and the huge barbarian looked almost pathetic as he steeled himself to go on. "They are cowards, these sorcerers," Otto Blenker said. "They do not show themselves." He raised his voice. "Is their aspect so loathsome that they are afraid lest we look upon them?" It was a challenge not taken up. As they pushed on through the passages, there was no sign either of Agak or his sister Gagak. It became gloomier and brighter in turns. Sometimes the passage narrowed so that it was difficult to squeeze their bodies through. Sometimes they widened into what were almost halls. Most of the time they appeared to be climbing higher into the building. Elric tried to guess the nature of the building's inhabitants. There were no steps in the castle, no artifacts he could recognize. For no particular reason, he developed an image of Agak and Gagak as reptilian in form, for reptiles would prefer gently rising passages to steps, and doubtless would have little need of conventional furniture. There again, it was possible that they could change their shape at will, assuming human form when it suited them. He was becoming impatient to face either one or both of the sorcerers. Ashnar the Lynx had other reasons, or so he said, for his own lack of patience. "They said there'd be treasure here," he muttered. "I thought to stake my life against a fair reward, but there's naught here of value." He put a horny hand against the damp material of the wall. "Not even stone or brook." "What are these walls made of, Elric?" Elric shook his head. "That has puzzled me also, Ashnar." And then Elric saw a large, fierce eye peering out of the gloom ahead. He heard a rattling noise, a rushing noise, and then the eyes grew larger and larger. He saw a red mouth, yellow fangs, orange fur, and then the growling sounded and the beast sprang at him even as he raised Stormbringer to defend himself and shouted a warning to the others. The creature was a baboon, but huge, and there were at least a dozen others following the first. Elric drove his body forward behind his sword, taking the beast in its groin. Claws reached out and dug into his shoulders and waist. He groaned as he felt at least one set of claws draw blood. His arms were trapped and he could not pull Stormbringer free. All he could do was twist the sword in the wound he had already made. With all his might he turned the hilt. The great ape shouted, its bloodshot eyes blazing, and it bared its yellow fangs as its muzzle shot towards Elric's throat. The teeth closed on his neck. The stinking breath threatened to choke him. Again he twisted the blade. Again the beast yelled in pain. The fangs were pressing into the metal of Elric's gorget, the only thing saving him from immediate death. He struggled to free at least one arm, twisting the sword for the third time, then tugging it sideways to widen the wound in the groin. The growls and groans of the baboon grew more intense, and the teeth tightened their hold on his neck. But now, mingled with the noises of the ape, he began to hear a murmuring, and he felt Stormbringer pulse on his hand. He knew that the sword was drawing power from the ape, even as the ape sought to destroy him. Some of that power began to flow into his body. Desperately, Elric put all his remaining strength into dragging the sword across the ape's body, slitting its belly wide so that its blood and entrails spilled over him, as he was suddenly free and staggering backwards, wrenching the sword out in the same movement. The ape too was staggering back, staring down in stupefied awe at its own horrible wound before it fell to the floor of the passage. Elric turned, ready to give aid to his nearest comrade, and he was in time to see Turndrick of Hashgan die, kicking in the clutches of an even larger ape, his head bitten from his shoulders and his red blood gouting. Elric drove Stormbringer cleanly between the shoulders of Turndrick's slayer, taking the ape in the heart. Beast and human victim fell together. 2 others were dead and several bore bad wounds, but the remaining warriors fought on, swords and armour smeared with crimson. The narrow passage stank of ape, of sweat, and of blood. Elric pressed into the fight, chopping at the skull of an ape which grappled with Hound's serpent tamer, who had lost his own sword. Hound darted a look of thanks at Elric as he bent to retrieve his blade, and together they set upon the largest of all the baboons. This creature stood much taller than Elric, and had Ericose pressed against the wall, Ericose's sword through its shoulder. From 2 sides, Hound and Elric stabbed, and the baboon snarled and screamed, turning to face the new attackers, Ericose's blade quivering in its shoulder. It rushed upon them, and they stabbed again together, taking the monster in its heart and its lung, so that when it roared at them, blood vomited from its mouth. It fell to its knees, its eyes dimming, and then sank slowly down. Now there was silence in the passage, and death lay all around them. Turndrick of Hashgan was dead. 2 of Corum's party were dead. All of Ericose's surviving men bore major wounds. 1 of Hawkmoon's men was dead, but the remaining 3 were virtually unscathed. Brute of Lashmar's helm was dented, but he was otherwise unwounded, and Ashnar the lynx was dishevelled, nothing more. Ashnar had taken 2 of the baboons during the fight, but now the barbarian's eyes rolled as he leaned panting against the wall. "I begin to suspect this venture of becoming uneconomical," he said with a half-grin. He rallied himself, stepping over a baboon's corpse to join Elric. "The less time we take over it, the better. What think you, Elric?" "I would agree." Elric returned his grin. "Come," and he led the way through the passage and into the chamber whose walls gave off a pinkish light. He had not walked far before he felt something catch at his ankle, and he stared down in horror to see a long, thin snake winding itself about his leg. It was too late to use his sword. Instead he seized the reptile behind its head and dragged it partially free of his leg before hacking the head from the body. The others were now stamping and shouting warnings to each other. The snakes did not appear to be venomous, but there were thousands of them appearing, it seemed, from out of the floor itself. They were flesh-coloured and had no eyes, more closely resembling earthworms than ordinary reptiles, but they were strong enough. Hound's serpent tamer sang a strange song now, many liquid, hissing notes, and this seemed to have a calming effect upon the creatures. One by one at first, and then in increasing numbers, they dropped back to the floor, apparently sleeping. Hound grinned at his success. Elric said, "Now I understand how you came by your surname." "I was not sure the song would work on these," Hound told him, "for they are unlike any serpents I've ever seen in the seas of my own world." They waded on through mounds of sleeping serpents, noticing that the next passage rose sharply. At times they were forced to use their hands to steady themselves as they climbed the peculiar, slippery material of the floor. It was much hotter in this passage, and they were all sweating, pausing several times to rest and mop their brows. The passage seemed to extend upwards forever, turning occasionally, but never levelling out for more than a few feet. At times it narrowed to little more than a tube through which they had to squirm on their stomachs, and at other times the roof disappeared into the gloom over their heads. Elric had long since given up trying to relate the position to what he had seen on the outside of the castle. From time to time, small, shapeless creatures rushed towards them in shoals, apparently with the intention of attacking them, but these were rarely more than an irritation and were soon all but ignored by the party as it continued its climb. For a while they had not heard the strange voice which had greeted them upon their entering, but now it began to whisper again, its tones more urgent than ever before. "Where? Oh, the pain." They paused, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Grim-faced they continued, plagued by thousands of little creatures which bit at their exposed flesh like so many gnats. Yet the creatures were not insects. Elric had seen nothing like them before. They were shapeless, primitive, and all but colourless. They battered at his face as he moved. They were like a wind. Half-blinded, choked, sweating, he felt his strength leaving him. The air was so thick now, so hot, so salty, it was as if he moved through liquid. The others were as badly affected as he. Some were staggering, and 2 men fell to be helped up again by comrades almost as exhausted. Elric was tempted to strip off his armour, but he knew that this would leave more of his flesh to the mercy of the little flying creatures. Still they climbed. Now more of the serpentine things they had seen earlier began to writhe around their feet, hampering them further, for all that Hound sang his sleeping song until he was hoarse. "We can survive this only a little longer," said Ashnar the lynx, moving close to Elric. "We shall be in no condition to meet the sorcerer if we ever find him or his sister." Elric nodded a gloomy voice. "My thoughts too, yet what else may we do, Ashnar?" "Nothing," said Ashnar in a low voice. "Nothing." Where? The word rustled all about them. Many of the party were becoming openly nervous.